the way I view the Bible, I would say, is different now. I don't like reading the Bible with a flat reading where I would just see it all as equally authoritative. I think that there are parts of the Bible that I would say, hey, that authority comes from Jesus. There are other parts, a lot in the Old Testament, where I'd say I might wrestle with that till I die. And I see Jesus holding that loosely, not tightly, if at all. So it has definitely changed the way I view the Bible. So I've said it. This, again, is not unique to me, but I've said it before in a way of, I believe in the Bible because I believe in Jesus. I don't believe in Jesus because I believe in the Bible.
I'm kind of in favor of questioning everything. But I think, there is a basis of values which our society or societies have agreed upon, largely on the basis of not doing harm to other people.
Hello, and welcome to Unbelievable, the show that gets Christians and non-Christians thinking together about the topics that matter to all of us. Today we're talking about deconstruction in the sense of deconstructing Christian faith, or becoming exvangelical is another phrase you might have come across. It refers to a process, some would say a movement, where individuals critically examine their beliefs, doctrines, and assumptions about Christianity. It often involves reevaluating traditional interpretations of Scripture, exploring different theological perspectives, and grappling with doubts and uncertainties. Many proponents of deconstruction argue that it can lead to a deeper and more authentic faith by shedding outdated or harmful beliefs and embracing a more personal and nuanced understanding of spirituality. Critics, on the other hand, express concerns that deconstruction can result in a crisis of one's most foundational beliefs crumble beneath them. But is this at all surprising? With failures of the church to reflect Jesus, with abuse by Christian leaders in the news daily, where is one to turn? Will deconstruction take you deeper, or will it destroy your belief altogether? A very warm welcome to my guests. On Unbelievable today, we have Olivia Jackson and Preston Ulmer. Olivia, seeing a lack of contemporary literature on faith deconstruction, carried out her own research. She wrote a book entitled Uncertain, which weaves together her story with the stories of 140 others into a collective memoir of deconstructing faith. Olivia, so glad to have you on the show. Welcome.
Hi, Vince.
Preston Ulmer is also with us. He is founder and director of the Doubters Club, an organization that encourages Christians and atheists and everyone in between to model friendship and pursue truth together. Preston is an author whose books include Deconstruct Faith, Discover Jesus, How Questioning Your Religion Can Lead You to a Healthy and Holy God. Great to have you with us, Preston.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Well, I'm so looking forward to speaking with you both. As I gave those introductions, I realized you both are working in areas and embracing words that it would be easier to avoid. Deconstruction and doubt are not exactly the words that tend to make you most popular at church. Both of you have, in a sense, centered your work and ministry in areas that a lot of people try to avoid. And I thought we might just start by asking why. What has motivated you both to focus in the ways that you have? Olivia, maybe you'd be willing to start us off there.
Yeah, I went through my own deconstruction process over a long period of time, and really, as you said, got frustrated with the lack of literature which really reflected ordinary people's journeys, and particularly being based in the UK. I found a lot of the voices out there were American, and it is a different church context. And I kind of thought, well, where are the British voices? And then thought, well, then I should write something, and then, had a crisis of confidence. But wanted to really, I enjoy hearing people's stories. I enjoy collecting stories. And ended up getting more than I bargained for with all the interviews. But it was just phenomenal to hear from people. And it was, sure, it's a controversial topic in some circles, but it was a tremendously moving and uplifting process, I think, and not something to be afraid of.
Wonderful. I spent 12 years in the UK, so I do appreciate that distinction that you're that you're talking about. I mean, the response when you first asked people for potential responses in terms of your research, was it surprising? Did you expect the number of responses that you received?
No, it was a fairly lengthy survey that I put out, and I thought, maybe I'll get 50 people filling this thing in. Maybe I'll interview 20 of them. I put it on a couple of platforms online, and it just kept going and kept going. I think about 400 people filled it in the end. And of those, probably about half offered to be interviewed. And for various reasons, I didn't get to interview all of those who offered, but they were from, all over the world, really. Probably about half from the UK, wow. But scattered everywhere.
Wow, what a privilege to be able to listen to such a diversity of stories. And Preston, you founded the Doubters Club. Most people run from doubt. You sort of ran toward it. Tell us a bit about your motivation.
Yeah, well, I like the phrase that Olivia used, ordinary people, that these deconstruction surrounding ordinary people. The Doubters Club, something that I started about 6 to 7 years ago in Denver, Colorado. And it was me and a friend who don't think like each other. He's an atheist and I'm a Jesus follower, but I have a history of doubt, a time where I just questioned everything, part of my own deconstruction journey. And that set the trajectory to just, I think being discontent, at least in America, with the traditional model of what it means to connect with God and then to live in community. And so here in the States, there's a lot, especially in evangelicalism, there's a lot of certainty seeking Christians. And I just find that to be wholly dissatisfying. So the Doubters Club is where you get two people, they don't think like each other, they're co-moderating conversations. It can never take place in the church. It's in coffee shops or pubs or bars. And anyways, we have over 100 Doubters Clubs in the world. We've trained people, and that kind of continues my deconstruction, that I don't think it's just a phase. I think it's a way of thinking now, like kind of de-weeding a flower bed, if you will. And so the more I continue to do Doubters Club, the more I realize this is the only way I really know how to be an authentic Jesus follower. So that'd be my journey in a nutshell. And you're right, it is a peculiar lane. I don't know if you feel that, Olivia, but I do feel that at times of when we speak on it, it's like people feel uncomfortable, which makes me wonder, what do we think we're doing if we're not deconstructing in order to find a more pure faith?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it is, as you say, a peculiar lane to follow, but and yet at the same time, I think it's a huge movement right now. So we're part of something bigger at the same time. And as you say, it's an ongoing and I think lifelong journey and way of being, really.
Well said. Well, I'm sure you both have received significant pushback at times for your efforts. I certainly want to personally thank you both for investing so much of yourselves, having looked at both of your books, just into loving and really listening to those who have struggled with faith, and in particular to those who have been hurt by the church. I think that's so deeply needed right now. And there's just so much that I want to talk to you both about. I'm excited to hear more about each of your stories. But just to start with, I thought we might start with some definitions, so we can be sure we don't miss each other at all in this conversation, because that word deconstruction, it can get thrown around a lot. It's a term that has some baggage to it. It has a substantial philosophical history, that some people carry into the conversation and some don't. I'd just like to hear, from each of you on this first, so we have a baseline for the conversation. Maybe you can start us off there, Preston. How do you use the term when you use that term deconstruction?
Yeah, when I use that term, what I'm talking about, and this is not unique to me, I'm quoting someone else here, but I'm talking about the picking apart of a belief, a system, or a practice, and then testing it for its truthfulness, usefulness, and effectiveness. And that's what I mean when I'm speaking of deconstruction. And I realize we're using same vocabulary, different dictionary with just about everyone that we come in contact with. So I'd love to hear Olivia's definition of it too.
Yeah, I'd very much agree with that. I mean, I think I phrased it as in the book as something like, a profound reassessment of one's core faith and core beliefs. So very, very similar, but it's definitely a very profound and core thing, and not just, oh, I changed my mind about one or two things. It goes deep. It goes to identity.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
You interviewed more people than I interviewed. What did you find started their deconstruction journey? Was it like I have people ask me a lot, is it personality style? I'm like, that's not personality style. What in your research?
It was a mixture. Sadly, for an awful lot of people, it was some profoundly negative experiences in Christian spaces. And I don't just mean they didn't like the preaching. I mean, there was some serious controlling, demanding, and often even abusive behavior going on. For others, it was simply running into, the harder parts of life where the faith that they had carried didn't make sense anymore, or just didn't have a theology for what they were experiencing. It was a real range of things across. I think there were certain themes, but it was certainly actually, hang on, the faith I know or the beliefs as I've been practicing them just don't work in this context.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the word profound. Olivia, I found that helpful because I was thinking, there are lots of different things in life where you do a review or you do an assessment. You do annual reviews at work every 5 years. A company gets their mission statement, their core values, their practices up on the board and says, do we need to tweak anything? Is this still what we're committed to? But it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, from both of your perspectives, that deconstruction is something that's deeper and it's more whole scale than just a review or an assessment. Is that fair?
I think there are certainly some myths out there about deconstruction, that it's, you just wanted to sin, or, you were never really saved. You just couldn't be bothered. It's just it's just a fashionable thing to do, this kind of stuff. And I think that profundity really lends the lie to those myths. Nobody goes that deep into their core beliefs and community and risks their core identity because they just couldn't be bothered, or and we're talking clergy and pastors here too. We're talking people walking away from decades of employment. Nobody does that because it's just a tweak or because they just wanted to sin or whatever.
To that point, I remember I was on a plane, this is in the middle, writing Deconstruct Faith, Discover Jesus. And there's a pastor who, he said, don't ever share my name, but you can share the story. So this is, you would know the name if I shared the name, but we just actually happened to sit next to each other. And we start talking, and he's talking about the Doubters Club. And it was a coast-to-coast flight. So we had about, a little over 3 hours. And to Olivia's point, he didn't have a space outside of that small aisle chair to be able to say, I'm deeply grieved by the way things are currently going and by his own theology. And there's a paycheck attached to that theology. And there's a paycheck attached to that methodology. And so for him, it's like, I don't know where to go with these questions, not just questions, but actually changing where he's landing on issues. Educated, loves people, loves God very much, but just the tradition that he finds himself in, it's hard for him to get out. And so I think that there's a lot of people that are speaking out about deconstruction, but then there's a ton of people that are on the fringe that I'm hoping both Olivia's book and my book will empower the fringe, honestly, to be able to say, I can live an authentic way, because behind them, there's a whole crowd of people that are like, we've been waiting for someone like this in our community. So there's just layers. It's so profound, both personally and communally. I think that there's a wave coming, and to be able to participate is a huge honor.
I want to pick up on the word that Preston just used, authentic, actually, because that was a word which came up again and again and again in interviews, is people searching for or discovering that sense of authenticity as they go through this process. It was a real, people saying, I feel, this is an authentic thing. This is an authentic journey. I feel more authentic now. And at the same time, people saying, but please use a pseudonym for me because, my family don't know, my church don't know, this is my employment or my marriage on the line, this kind of thing. It was really tough stuff. I had a number of people whose marriages were under strain. Wow,
that's really telling. This idea of deconstruction, is it, obviously we hear a lot of stories of people who deconstruct from a place of faith, into a place where maybe there's not belief in God or there's movement away from the church. As you two understand the term, is this something that can happen in the other direction? Is it something where someone who maybe doesn't believe or who is agnostic can go through a deconstruction process with respect to their beliefs and possibly even actually wind up in a faith position? Or is there something, one way about it, that it moves from a religious position to a non-religious position?
Well, I'll say in the Doubters Club, obviously we would hope that the reverse happens. We don't want to have ulterior motives, but we do hope that you question faith and you question certainty, and that would go for all sides and all worldviews. But it is harder to go, in my experience, I'll speak for myself here and the people I'm connected to, it's harder to go in that reverse direction because the church doesn't seem to be all that accepting to someone who has been outside, changed their mind, found new perspectives, a new way of looking at the world, but may actually say, I'm intrigued or compelled by the story of this man named Jesus, right? And although they didn't deconstruct out of rebellion, but out of recovery, part of that recovery would be come into a community. And it is just so difficult to find a church community that would be accepting to someone who has changed perspectives, but is trying to follow Jesus. That would be the simplest way I could put it. The more receptive a body of believers are to that journey, and by receptive, I actually don't just mean come to a small group. I mean they're allowed to participate, they have a voice at the table, those sort of things. Then the more receptive that person will be to then following a Jesus-looking God, as we see in the scriptures. But you could understand, it's like the hermit crab thing. A hermit crab outgrows its shell and tries to enter a new shell. It gets chopped up in the process. And so it's the same deal. Someone's outgrown their shell and they try to re-enter an evangelical church, they're going to be chopped up. So that's the goal of Doubters Club, is to be safe shells in cities. But there is a lot of work to be done, at least here, when it comes to helping churches to be receptive to forever deconstructionists and skeptics. Yeah.
All right. So you're both quite positive about deconstruction. Let me challenge that just a little bit. I was thinking about the fact that a lot of Christians that I know, they conceive of their faith first and foremost as a relationship. They would talk about a relationship with God. And I was thinking about this word deconstruction and wondering how it fits in the context of thinking about faith as a relationship. So even in terms of my relationship with my wife Jo, if I tell her that I want to sort of review our marriage or even do a marriage assessment, I mean, that actually is something that we do regularly. We want to be doing that. We want to be identifying areas to strengthen. But I feel like if I went to her and said, hey, I want to go through a process of deconstruction of our relationship, that might not go down as well. So I just wanted to bring that term into the context of those who conceive of faith first and foremost as a relationship. How would you think about that? Is there any sense in which deconstruction is more natural with respect to ideas or understandings or even structures than it is with respect to relationships?
Olivia, you want to go first, or?
No, but
okay.
if you want to jump in, feel free.
Here's what's so interesting about your question. I don't think deconstruction is something that you would say, okay, God, now's the time that we deconstruct, or I deconstruct the faith. I think deconstruction is the way to be in a relationship. And so it's, as you're talking, I'm going back to when Jacob wrestles with God, his name changes to Israel, and Israel means to strive with God. Or if you ask rabbis, they might tell you God wrestler, and God names the Israelites God wrestlers, right? I mean, his people, the Israelites, God wrestlers. So it's almost as if, hey, deconstructing, being that you're picking apart to find what's truthful, useful, and effective with God and with the way to live with each other, that is the relationship. It's a constant wrestling match back and forth, because we are authentically, although we're in relationship with him, we are disconnected from him. We can't see him or feel him in ways that we can with our spouse. And so it would be much more persuasive to a skeptic to be able to say, hey, you don't have to change that to be in a relationship. That muscle actually might be what is required for an authentic, true relationship. And I think you could find prophets. I think you find Jesus doing the same thing. I think you find, obviously, let's fast forward to the Reformation, you find the same thing. It's actually maybe the way to be in a relationship, not like you're sitting in a counseling office with God and say, now's the moment we're going to do this,
And would you say similar about other relationships in life as well, or is that sort of particular to the way you conceive of a relationship with God?
Well, now here's where the difference comes in. If someone's listening to this and if they say, wait a second, we can't ask God those questions or whatever, there's a type of Christianity that is I referenced this earlier, a certainty-seeking Christianity, right? That it's like, I need the answer. And in as much as that's your relationship to God, then you're going to feel very disoriented by this term deconstruction and by this way of being. In the same way, if you're in a relationship like my spouse, my wife, Lisa, if it was like, hey, I need to be right in our relationship, or I need her to always be right in the relationship, and that every disagreement just stops whenever there's no arguing or how would we say that, passionate discussion. Okay, there's no if there's no disagreements whatsoever, the relationship, someone's being inauthentic in this relationship. And I think that's also true with God. This is why I do not think that the opposite of faith is doubt. I think the opposite of faith is certainty, and because faith requires doubt, it requires wrestling. Yes, I would say you have to do that for healthy relationships. And I think my counselor would say the same thing.
Olivia, would you agree with that or make any distinctions?
I mean, I think, deconstruction is not it doesn't sound like a naturally relational word. And it's a term that a lot of people who go through this process dislike, actually. And they prefer something like unraveling or unpicking or all sorts of things, but it's the word that we're using at the moment. It's the word which people are gathering around, and therefore, we continue to use it, but it doesn't mean that it's devoid of relationship. And I think it's very much, you talk about your relationship with a spouse. Well, it's also a matter of kind of going, oh, actually, you know what? I always thought this about my spouse because, Mike down the road told me this about my spouse. And actually, I'm having to realize that actually that's not what my spouse is like at all, and Mike was wrong, or maybe that's just Mike's perspective, or Mike and my spouse had a falling out a while back, or had an argument over the fence, or whatever. It's a peeling away of things that other people have said over time and in different contexts to actually get to, okay, what do I really believe about God, about the divine? And I think it is a profoundly relational thing. And I think we've lost that tradition, sadly, that Jewish tradition of wrestling with God, with one another, a healthy wrestling with one another.
Do you find deconstruction a helpful term, Olivia? You kind of referenced this slightly. Is it one that you recommend using? You use in all contexts, or maybe just certain contexts, or open to other language as well?
I would say, I'm open to other language. Any word it's a placeholder really for what's actually going on. Whether it's we call this pen. Well, that's just a sound that we make to represent this object. And likewise, deconstruction it's a word that we use to represent this particular process, and it's not the same as the Derrida philosophical deconstruction, although there are overlaps. But I think it's it is just the word that we happen to be using. I don't even know quite where people started using it for this particular process. But I think it also, some people have sort of said, well, it sounds like you're dismantling something, or it sounds like a negative. And, hey, if the shoe doesn't fit, then the shoe doesn't fit. It just happens to be the word that we are, gathering around right now. And I can understand why something like unraveling or unpicking or whatever may fit some people better.
Okay, great. Jump in briefly, Preston, then we're going to take a break, but go ahead and make a final point.
Well, I was just going to say, I do prefer the word, maybe a little stronger than Olivia. I prefer the word deconstruction over unraveling, because it is getting to a foundation, right? The idea of you're deconstructing to get to a foundation. And people, in doing this and being specific and not throwing baby Jesus out with the church bathwater, right? You're getting specific now. They're getting to what is the foundation of what I believe, why I believe, all those things. Unraveling, unpicking part. I've had a lot of pastors say, what's the difference between this and questioning? And it's an incredibly different process, in my opinion. Yeah.
That's helpful. We're going to take a quick break. Remember, we always love to hear from you, our listeners. Don't forget, you can email us at unbelievable@premier.org.uk, or get in touch on social media, Unbelievable FE on Twitter, or on Facebook, Premier Unbelievable. Still so much to talk about. You're listening to Premier's Unbelievable with Vince Vitale, and my guests today are Preston Ulmer and Olivia Jackson. We'll be back in just a minute.
The mind and brain are connected, but the scientific data doesn't enable you to establish the nature of that connection or the relationship.
Just because science can't demonstrate that physical processes and mental processes are the same thing, that in and of itself doesn't give you any evidence that that's not the case either.
Some people talk about seeing deceased relatives and communicating with them.
This idea of floating up out of your body and watching things happen and being able to describe it afterwards, that could be formed in your imaginative mind.
Conscious experience and brain processes are two fundamentally different things.
I wonder if we're talking about...
Would you like me to go out for a bit? You guys seem really happy.
Welcome back to part 2 of this discussion on Premier Unbelievable, where my guests are Olivia Jackson and Preston Ulmer. Today, we're considering the topic of deconstruction, taking a deep, profound dive into what you believe, what you've taken for granted, and perhaps never even questioned. Both of my guests interviewed hundreds of people on this topic and have much to share with us, not just about the idea of deconstruction, but about the real-life experience of it. Preston and Olivia, some of our listeners may be wondering, is deconstruction for me? Is it something I should do? Or perhaps they're even coming to the realization that it is a process they are in the midst of. I wanted to ask you, sort of on behalf of our listeners, who, when, and what? Who should deconstruct? And if they should, when should they do so? And then thirdly, what is it that we actually deconstruct when we go through that process? Preston, maybe I'll throw that to you. I know you have an acronym for the way that the model of deconstruction that you recommend, FUSE, F-U-S-E. Maybe that's relevant to this question, but tell us how you think about this.
Well, maybe it's just because I wrote the book, but I do think everyone should go on this journey. Okay, so I think it's, in fact, the person who says I don't need to, in my opinion, would be the person who probably does. Again, when we get stuck into certainty, then we just become dogmatic and rigid. So I'd say who? The person who doesn't think they need to, right? The person who is, they already are. What? There is an acronym in my book of lighting the fuse. It's like, I talk about Mount Rushmore and getting a face in a mountain. And what if we got the face of Jesus in the mountain of religion instead of the face of the church, or all those things, So the acronym is find the specific, be very specific about it. Don't be general. Let's try to get, instead of saying I'm deconstructing because of hypocrisy, can we get to what it actually was or is that we're talking about? And then the U is understand where it came from. Or are we dealing with a tradition, a practice, a preference, a bias? Are we dealing with the authority of God as seen in the face of Jesus? Which that is very important to me, not just the authority of the Bible, but the authority of God as seen in Jesus. Where does that come from? The S is share the impact. Do this in community with trusted people. Share the impact this is having on you as you're going through it. And then the E is engage with what remains. And if God is real and has revealed himself to us, then he will remain in the process. So that's, I would say people who don't think they need to. And then what I would say, be specific. And then there's the rest of it.
Okay. Olivia, is there anything sort of in that process that you would think differently about?
I think, who, again, it was, it's that sort of thing of, if our faith isn't constantly, growing as we grow, as people, then is it really living? And I don't think that, it's a funny mixture, because I think, as I was saying before, we've got away from that sense of wrestling, as a culture, and within Christian spaces, we've got away from that sense of wrestling. I was very aware that a lot of people I interviewed were trying to get away from an idea of should, because they had spent a lot of time in church spaces where they were being told, you should do this, you should believe that. So in terms of who should deconstruct, that's a more complex one for me. But I think everybody. I think it's a healthy thing for human beings to wrestle with what they really with their faith. In terms of what, again, I was very much aware of. The line that I took in my book was much more observational than it was instructional. I didn't want to write a how to deconstruct. Partly because, again, I felt a lot of people had been told how to within their Christian spaces, but also because I didn't really feel qualified to speak into somebody else's journey. So the what, I think, is very much a kind of follow the truth. And if the truth is the truth, then, if you're doing that with integrity and authenticity, then, you're probably on the right path. And there may be some missteps, but even that, what's a misstep?
I appreciate the humility in that. So Preston, interesting answer, sort of everyone. So even the person who, would say they're finding joy, peace, purpose, fulfillment in their faith, they should still deconstruct.
Yeah, I think so, because if you put the right person in front of them, then they will practice that deconstruction muscle, right? They will deconstruct the person. So I'm going to be stereotypical on purpose, okay? But in some of my interviews, I didn't just interview progressive deconstruction, people that are deconstructing. I mean, let's take someone who's conservative. They are happy with their faith. They go to a smaller church, everyone kind of thinks the same. They have potlucks after Sunday gatherings, okay? Which all of these things, fine, but if you put someone who would be progressive or liberal in their estimation in front of them, the likelihood of them being able to connect and continue a relationship with that person is fairly low. And we've seen that in the interviews, as people would say, oh, those are my kids. I was just in New Orleans this last weekend speaking on this, and that is one of the number one parent that comes up to me would be, oh, my kid is leaving the faith. Why is your kid leaving the faith? Well, they interpret the Bible differently, or they don't believe the Bible is the authority, right? And they would give these things that has now compromised their relationship. So I'm not saying just for their own good should they deconstruct, reconsider, have a profound evaluation, as Olivia said, profound assessment. I think is the word. I like those words. But I would say for the sake of the relationships with the people not like them, which in Christianity is highly missional and what it means to follow Jesus. And so that's why, Vince, I say, yeah, everyone needs to do this and be able to do it. And then I don't know where I land. I'm still thinking about, do they go through it and then stop? I think it's a way of being, and it can be healthy. And that's, I think, what Olivia and I are trying to do, is contribute to that discussion in a healthy manner.
Olivia, reading through so many of the personal stories in your book, it occurred to me that so much of what people tragically have experienced, abusive leaders, misleading interpretations of scripture, self-promotion, all of these things seem to be precisely some of the things that Jesus often challenged and perhaps you'd say deconstructed. I mean, do you think of Jesus as a deconstructionist in that sense?
Yeah, I think in some senses, he very much, he did that real profound reassessment of the faith, the beliefs that were around him, both in terms of the religious context, but also the political context. It was very much a holistic reassessment of the status quo. And it's, I think that's very much a number of people sort of said to me, I've shed everything else, but I still follow Jesus. And look to him. And for some people, it was very much a case of looking at the Christian context they were in and going, that's not the Jesus I follow. And for others, it was more of a, often where there was severe trauma, they really felt they actually had to walk away altogether in order to be able to heal.
Would you mind, Olivia, sharing a bit, from your own personal experience of deconstruction, what impact has that had on your view of Jesus or how you think about him?
I think, as with any deconstruction journey, that's something which is very much in process. And it's, looking at holding things lightly and being able to go, well, I am uncertain. I've called the book Uncertain because it is a getting away from certainties and a continual reassessment. And it's a re-looking at, how do we look at Jesus, at who Jesus was, at who Jesus is, what is worth holding on to. And for me, that was a process of things which I hadn't discovered before, things like going back and discovering, learning New Testament Greek and learning it from somebody who wasn't herself a Christian. She was actually Jewish. Well, she described herself as a Jewish atheist, but also looking at what other Christian traditions have said about Jesus, and ultimately a process of kind of going, well, is this someone I want to continue to follow or not? For me, deconstruction is it leaves things wide open, and some people have ended up is a really poor choice of phrase actually, but some people have gone down an atheist path. Some people have gone down a very agnostic path or a very exploratory path. Some people have gone down a path of actually getting ordained. So, it really, and a number of people said, this is the Jesus I never knew was possible. This is so much better.
Wow.
So in a real process, which just takes different people differently.
Absolutely. How about you, Preston? On the one hand, you've recommended deconstruction for everyone. You're really suspicious of certainty, and yet you're still a pastor. So tell me a bit about how your experience of deconstruction has impacted the way that you view Jesus.
Yeah, it's actually changed the way I view the Bible. I would say is different now. I don't like reading the Bible with a flat reading where I would just see it all as equally authoritative. I think that there are parts of the Bible that I would say, hey, that authority comes from Jesus. There are other parts, a lot in the Old Testament where I'd say I might wrestle with that till I die. And I see Jesus holding that loosely, not tightly, if at all. So it has definitely changed the way I view the Bible. So I've said it. This, again, is not unique to me, but I've said it before in a way of, I believe in the Bible because I believe in Jesus. I don't believe in Jesus because I believe in the Bible. So everything that I read in Scripture is through this Jesus-looking God lens, as opposed to trying to make sense of Jesus through everything that I'm reading. And that's actually what brought me back into the faith. So that's been a big difference. And it's allowed me to, like, the things that maybe I was more legalistic on before, realizing that I need to deconstruct and the doubts that I had, the things I was legalistic about, I don't want to say I don't care about, they just don't matter to me all that much anymore. People matter more to me than doctrine in so many areas. And I know that could be a rabbit hole if we went down that one, but that's how it's probably changed the way I pastor as well.
Okay. Do you think there's a natural trajectory from deconstructing church, one's experience of church, or evangelicalism in particular, to then deconstruction with respect to Jesus? I was thinking some people might really want to, pull those apart and say, hey, like deconstruct the church, but that doesn't mean you need to deconstruct your personal faith in Jesus. But on the other hand, I can imagine someone saying, well, look, as you deconstruct the church, as you hear some of the stories that we see in Olivia's book, that's really, within, the Doubters Club, isn't it the case that if Christianity is true, the Holy Spirit, the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, is supposed to inhabit the church, inhabit believers, and there's supposed to be a difference, right? It seems to me we're supposed to be able to look at the church and say, there's something healthy here. There's something here that reflects the things that are great about Jesus. And so many people are not finding that when they look to the church. So is there actually a trajectory there where when you start to deconstruct the church, you actually wind up realizing, hey, is that actually an argument against the reality of Jesus if the church is not looking like the church, it seems biblically, is supposed to look when Jesus' Spirit inhabits the church? How would either of you, respond to that type of reasoning? Do you think there's that natural trajectory? You start deconstructing the church, but if you're actually consistent and coherent about it, you will wind up deconstructing Jesus as well.
A lot of people deconstruct the church because they're seeing Jesus more clearly. And a lot of times it's also because, again, what Olivia's talked about, what I talk about in my book is this working? Is this work? Like, does this work in the world? And so much of what we experience in traditional evangelical models just isn't working, and it's not a way that someone said it in an interview. It's just not real life. And so they're deconstructing actually based on the clarity that they're having around the person of Jesus. I would say that this is where it's really important to say there is a difference between deconstructing and deconversion. Those are different things. And so someone who would say, oh, I'm deconverted out of Christianity because they reject the claims, not of Scripture, but they reject the claims of Jesus, right? The revelation of God as we see known in Jesus. That would be, surely deconstruction might have played a part, but that would be a wholly different topic, I think, than actually saying, hey, I'm deconstructing the church, but they're deconstructing against a different standard. And usually that standard is the ethic of Jesus. And so that's where that, I don't know, I don't think one leads to the other. Olivia, what do you think? Did you see one leading to the other?
I saw the full range. I think, for quite a lot of people, I mean, it also begs the question of what is the reality of Jesus? We've got to remember that we see Jesus as a projection very often of our own culture. We're seeing Jesus 2,000 years after he was alive on this earth. We're seeing Jesus through the lens of the culture and the country that we've grown up in, through the certainly, in our case, through the medium of the English language, etc. And it's peeling back as well. Well, which bits of this are just my Western evangelical culture, or whatever culture it is that I've been in. And I think in terms of sort of the deconstruction, deconversion overlap, again, all over the map, I think that deconstruction can lead people to deconvert. But then people can deconvert without deconstructing, and I think and sometimes it doesn't lead people to deconvert. It's and then certainly there were one or two I'd spoken to who definitely went through the deconstruction, deconverted, and then after a time of healing, actually kind of went, actually, I'm ready to look at this Jesus person again. And for some of them, they came back to a very different faith, and for some of them, they went, actually, you know what, I'm an atheist and I don't think Jesus was divine, but I still find him incredibly compelling and someone I want to, aspire to be like. So, that's all over the map, Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. And is it possible to go through a process of deconstruction and through a very profound process where much is taken apart and then reconstructed, is it possible that some people actually wind up, with a faith and even connected to communities that look, at least on the surface, somewhat similar to where they started, but they've sort of gone through this very profound process of deconstruction and actually returned there in a healthier way and a stronger way? Do you both think that that's possible, or is it inherent to deconstruction that you wind up in a substantially different place?
Well, it depends on if the community will accept you, would be a big question I would have with that. Is, sometimes they're forced to go to a different community because the community doesn't accept them. I have never, both in research and in interviews and my personal encounters, I've never seen someone deconstruct and hold and go back to the exact same way of faith. I mean, it's impossible. But I just am, your question makes me think, would the community accept them? And it's probably unlikely, because the community usually plays a part in why that person participated in going down that road in the first place.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with all of that. I didn't find anybody who came back to the same faith. It profoundly changed them as well as their faith. And in terms of community acceptance, I think a lot of people were coming from communities where you either buy the whole package or you're out. And that was part of the problem. And so if you go through a deconstruction, you come back in with a reworked faith, with a reassessed faith, you don't really get back in, except possibly as a target for evangelism.
And so I'm thinking of this sort of person who, maybe is within a community, maybe an evangelical community of faith, and goes through a real wrestle about a variety of things having to do with the church, having to do with the authority of Scripture, goes through, a season of profound doubt, profound reorienting of how they understand things, perhaps for quite different reasons, arrives back at beliefs that, core beliefs that look evangelical in nature, and sort of re-enters the evangelical church. That's the sort of thing that either you're saying happens very rarely, or perhaps is not actually deconstruction. Which of those two sounds right?
It happens rarely, for sure.
Okay.
People who deconstruct out of evangelicalism, again, now in America, a lot of the reasons are going to revolve around politics, things that popped up, and would probably purity culture, politics, and then issues around LGBTQ inclusion. And so evangelical churches will lean a certain way on all three of those issues. And so for someone who deconstructed for any of those top three, for them they would not re-enter. They wouldn't want to re-enter that community, because again, that community would be drawing barriers and lines where they don't draw lines.
Yes, sort of assuming that in the end they actually do come to a firm belief that is contrary to their original belief. But I'm just thinking, aren't there people who go through a process of deconstruction and then actually arrive back for either different reasons, or because they've looked more closely to core beliefs that are pretty similar to their original beliefs?
I wonder, I think it's, there's much of the reason why people start on a process of deconstruction is because something's not working.
That's right.
And I think it's very difficult for something to not work. You deconstruct and then suddenly it works again.
I see.
That doesn't tend to be how things work, I think.
That's helpful.
I think like I'm thinking it's like an allergy. Like my youngest daughter has a peanut allergy, right? So then she goes away from peanuts. She will never re-enter peanuts. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that. Like people are allergic to certain things spiritually, and exactly what Olivia said. It would just be unique. And I'm trying. The reason I'm talking slower is I'm trying to think if I've seen that happen, and I haven't seen that. I'd be curious if Olivia has either.
Yeah, maybe that I'm getting at a slightly different phenomenon. I was actually, thinking partly of my wife, who went through a season in her master's studies in biblical studies, of sort of profoundly, in my head, I was thinking kind of, deconstructing the way she thought about the Bible, and really being challenged to see that from the perspective of others, including those that she was sort of studying with. And several years later, I would say that now if I think about what her sort of commitments are about Scripture today and what they were in her teenage years, the core commitments are actually pretty similar, but there's this incredibly profound process that she went through in the middle where those were really called into question, and she became much more mature, and I would say sort of strengthened in who she is as a person and in the way she works through things in route to that. So that's actually the person that I had in mind, and I was trying to think, through, is that a process of deconstruction, or is it something which is slightly different?
We should have interviewed your wife. We both missed it by not interviewing.
I would highly recommend it. And you have a UK connection, Olivia, as well. Well, let's pause there. We have one more segment, which I'm really looking forward to. I still want to talk about young people, how they are deconstructing, but we need to take a break first. We will see you back here in a moment. And let us know what you think of the show by emailing at unbelievable@premier.org.uk. See you in just a moment.
You would call yourself an atheist?
I would, yes.
I would call myself a Christian humanist.
One of the big themes over the history of what we now think of as science has been questioning the exceptionalism of humankind.
I think the critical thing is what gives something value. Would you say that minds construct meaning or detect meaning?
I have had made from a little piece of my arm something that could reasonably be called a second brain.
I think one of the real challenges that evolution by natural selection puts to Christian belief is the idea that
Welcome back to the third and final part of our discussion between Olivia Jackson, author of Uncertain, a collective memoir of deconstructing faith, and Preston Ulmer, founder of the Doubters Club, which creates space for Christians and atheists to model friendship and pursue truth alongside each other. I'm Vince Vitale, and you're listening to Unbelievable, the show that gets Christians and non-Christians thinking together about the topics that matter to all of us. Well, I'm really enjoying learning from you both, Preston and Olivia, and I wanted to start this last segment by reflecting a little bit more generally on this idea of certainty and uncertainty. You both have referenced it. You both have seemed to speak about certainty as something that we should at least be suspicious of. The title of your book, Olivia, is Uncertain, and the un is in parentheses, which got me thinking about this, and perhaps the fact that it seems like we need to be certain about some things in life, sort of bedrock assumptions, right? There are certain things, the fact that our reasoning processes are aimed at truth. Some people would say that objective good and evil exist, or that truth itself has value. Like there's certain bedrock, bare minimum assumptions that we at least have to have a high level of confidence in to even be able to have the sort of conversation that we're having. And yet, on the other side of things, it's quite clear that having certainty about everything is really problematic and leads to all sorts of unhealth and all sorts of harm. I remember when I was teaching seminarians, I used to ask them early in the year, write down a belief of yours that has changed significantly in the last few years. And my point was that if you couldn't think of any substantial belief of yours that changed in any way in the last few years, that might be problematic. That might mean that you have actually stopped listening to others, or at least in such a way where what they have to say could actually persuade you. But what I want to talk about is, how are we supposed to know the difference? Like, how are we supposed to determine, this seems so important to deconstruction, what it's actually healthy and okay for us to be certain about, or at least have a high degree of confidence in, and then what goes into the box of the things that actually we should be quite uncertain about, and we should be very open-handed about that. Maybe I'll start with you, Olivia. How do you approach this? How do you think about what it's okay to be certain about and what we should actually be uncertain about?
I'm kind of in favor of questioning everything.
Okay.
But I think, there is a basis of values which our society or societies have agreed upon, largely on the basis of not doing harm to other people. I'm aware that, I'm aware as I say that one of the hardest things for me about deconstruction was actually facing up to harmful things I did and said to other people in the name of God. And particularly when I was, teens, 20s, etc. And I, whilst feeling that, this belief system makes me a better person. So I think, it's the matter of actually kind of going, where am I harming other people? Where am I harming myself? We can do all these things in healthy or less healthy ways. And that, that's inside church and outside of church. And that is, with a set of beliefs or without that set of beliefs. But I think a sort of a basis of shared values is a good place to start.
And that's one of the places I think your book is so helpful, Olivia, because it really helps to identify where are people being hurt. And if we listen well, it's so important that we come to a deeper understanding of that. Preston, how about for you? Does that resonate, what Olivia shared?
Yes, I think questioning everything. In fact, when you posed us the question, Vince, you said certainty once or many times, and then you said high levels of confidence. And I would say those are two very different things. And we
great. Yeah, share more about that.
Yeah, we operate in high levels of confidence. And let me just speak like pragmatically here. Like this, I'm in my house, I'm in my office right here. If someone were to say, and we have storms going through, if someone were to say, hey, how do you know, how are you absolutely certain that your house won't topple over when a heavy storm comes? I don't have absolute certainty, but I have high levels of confidence. Okay, so I will commit to a course of action based on the confidence that I have. And then you go to what the Christian faith really is, which is not these absolutes necessarily. It's based on a relationship with God. So I'd speak with my wife, right? If I'm getting married to Lisa and someone said, how do you know when she's 50, she's not going to run off with some 25-year-old? And I'd be like, well, I don't know, and you should not attend my wedding. Okay, but I say I don't know with certainty, but I have a high level of confidence based on what I've learned in my interaction. So I will commit in the face of uncertainty based on the confidence I have. That to me is life in general. That's like, if that's the expectation of what we can see and the relationships we can actually feel, how much more should we say, of course, that's acceptable to the God that we can't see and we can't actually feel among us yet. So that's what I'd say. Confidence and certainty, very different things.
No, helpful distinction for sure. And in the process of deconstruction, do you find it challenging not to trade one certainty for another? So like not certainty with respect to maybe belief in God or our church commitments, but potentially certainty, really high level of confidence with respect to the fact that everyone should deconstruct, or maybe that at least they shouldn't wind up back in the perils of evangelicalism. Is there a temptation or a challenge there to wind up trading one certainty for another?
Yeah, I think you could become a fundamentalist in the deconstruction world for sure. And someone I interviewed, Josh Harris, he saw this with the deconstructionists that he's interacted with. They're just, and we've all seen it. You can become a fundamentalist type person on any topic, whether you'd be progressive or whether you'd be conservative on any topic. And I think what we're looking for is not, we're not looking to stay in a state of perplexity, right? Where we're like, okay, well, it's all up for grabs. I think what we're looking for is a state of humility of saying, okay, I will identify this is my bias, right? I mean, I said I think everyone should deconstruct. I'll also admit that is a Preston Ulmer bias and preference. But you did ask me what I think. So that if we can just identify, that opens our hands a little bit, that hey, that's a preference and a bias, maybe an educated one and an informed one, but nevertheless a personal one.
Yeah, great. Maybe you could speak to that as well, Olivia. Even it's right in the title of your book. Should we be certain that we should be uncertain?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real difficulty when you have grown up with a very black and white mindset, with a very certain mindset, because actually, simply in the way that our brains work, it is very difficult to go from that to a place of questioning, uncertainty, listening to dissenting voices I disagree with, this kind of thing. Very easy to swap one black and white mindset for another. But I think a lot of, a real deep dive on deconstruction, it doesn't just turn the tables over, it gets rid of the tables. It goes, do we need tables? Maybe we need chairs. Or what about what they're doing over there, which I always thought was wrong. I think there's been so much, certainly the background I have come from it, there's been so much othering, and it would be very easy to just turn around and, do the othering back the other way. And I think, for me, doing this journey with integrity means listening to the voices I disagree with, from sort of whatever source they're coming from, which is why I ended up I wanted to include people who still believed, didn't believe, pagans, agnostics, etc., and include the whole lot in the book. I think it's too easy to just become a fundamentalist in the other direction.
Excellent. No, I love that both of you share that in common as well. Some of our listeners may be wondering if they should deconstruct, or as you both have pointed out, it's often not a conscious decision that someone makes at some point, but may be realizing for the first time that they're actually in a process of deconstruction. What advice would you each give to someone who's listening, to this show and finds themselves in that place? Preston?
The person who realizes that they're in this process.
Yes.
What you're saying. Yeah. This feels more strange if you do it than when I say it, but be incredibly authentic with your questions and your answers, right? Don't try to ask the safe questions because that's safe. Otherwise you're going to get aggravated, and then there's not going to be movement. And that's what I was saying earlier. I think there's a lot of people, and clearly, Olivia even pointed this out, there's even clergy that they're in this space of they have questions, so they're going to ask the safe questions. Ask the questions you need to ask, and then go for the answer, or at least what is most right? That would be a more Jewish way of thinking about it. What is most right with the information that I have? So the experience and the education collide together, and you're on a journey, and be okay with letting that lead you to another question, to another question, and to another question. I remember I put out kind of this survey online of, hey, what out of these top 6 things, what do you wish was people would deconstruct, evangelical Christians would deconstruct? And so many people are saying the traditional view of hell, and I would write them and ask them why, and they said, because it actually ties into all the other ones, right? And being okay with it is a journey. So deconstruction is actually not a destination. You're not like, oh, I did it and I got the t-shirt and I rode the roller coaster and I survived. It's like, hey, I'm doing it and I'm asking questions that are deeply personal to me. I'm getting counseling if I need to. There's a lot of religious trauma counselors now that it's going to be so helpful for the church. We'll probably see the fruit of that in the next few years. But I'm just saying, be incredibly authentic, do it with integrity, and do it in community. So if you have a spouse, you'd have to be honest. That might result in marriage counseling. You got to be honest with it. Do it in community. And if you have to leave the community you're part of, you have to leave the community you're part of. But otherwise, just trying it on and doing it a little bit, it's not authentic. There's not integrity to it. And it's actually going to be very aggravating to your soul.
How about for you, Olivia?
I would absolutely agree with Preston. And I would sort of add into that, in that authenticity, trust yourself, learn to trust yourself. From one of the biggest things that came up in the interviews, particularly amongst women, was that they had been taught to not trust themselves. They had very much had verses taken out of context and used against them about, the heart is deceitful, etc. And they had systematically been taught not to trust themselves and their own instinct. And actually, part of deconstruction was a relearning how to trust themselves. And I think if you're going to ask those questions with authenticity, that is part of that learning process. You've got to trust that you have authenticity, that your questions are valid. And in terms of, finding community, again, trust yourself. There are some very robust spaces online, which are not necessarily particularly pleasant places. They can be quite angry spaces. And there's a space for anger for a lot of people. But again, seeing actually, this is a bit toxic for me right now. I need to get out of that. Or, I need to find friends who will support me and hold me in this, and knowing that you're not alone, that there are lots of us out there, knowing that if you do find a counsellor, and I think therapy is a huge thing, a huge help in deconstruction for a lot of people, but also being able to kind of go, actually, I trust myself enough to know that this counsellor is not right for me right now. And again, that's coming back to that authenticity and learning to trust yourself.
And then alongside trusting yourself, you've alluded to it, but what voices would you also recommend having input from or coming alongside you in the context of this process?
There are certainly authors out there who I found hugely helpful. Sue Monk-Kidd was definitely one of them. I think a lot of people have looked to people like Richard Rohr, Marcus Borg. It's also just opening up a whole world. For me, it was part of this at the beginning was opening up a whole world of authors that had been off limits, which was hugely freeing as well. But certainly, Sue Monk-Kidd is fantastic. And then there are spaces online. There are a lot of podcasts out there as well, which people like Pete Enns with the Bible for Normal People, Nomad podcast in the UK, where you get some scholarship, you get a variety of voices, and it's learning to kind of go, okay, I can trust myself enough to listen to this stuff and listen to it in good faith and learn from other voices.
Yes, as a pastor, Preston, I was wondering if someone's starting this process of deconstruction, but at the beginning of the process, at least, let's say they still believe in God, how do you counsel someone in terms of, is God one of the conversation partners that actually can interact in the context of this process, or do you almost have to sort of bracket that in order to move forward? How do you talk to people about that?
What's so interesting is, like Olivia mentioned, people like Richard Rohr, okay, he doesn't just lead you to maybe some new perspectives, but he has spiritual practices. Deconstructionists, like being in a deconstruction phase or space, spiritual practices are extremely helpful. I know for me, if I'm pastoring someone who's going through this, typically, not all the time, but typically the ideas of prayer and Bible reading, it's just, I'll just say this, it's such white noise, because again, there's a reaction against what's been done. And a lot of the antidote to a hard life was read your Bible more, pray more, all those sorts of things. And so finding refreshing ways to allow people to participate in communion with God that's actually rooted back in Christianity, more in the Eastern Christianity than Western, but it's rooted in Christianity. Spiritual practices are incredibly useful. So I would not pastor someone away from communion with God, but I would pastor them towards a new way to commune with God that's actually an ancient practice. Refreshing perspectives are so compelling to someone who has a kind of reaction against the norm.
That's a helpful nuance. For either of you, how would your advice change or not when it comes to young people deconstructing? I've at least heard some people, express particular concerns with young people going through this profound process of deconstruction, perhaps when, there hasn't been that time to really substantially construct something in the first place. Does that impact at all your advice or not, and why?
I'm going to let Olivia jump in. You go first.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I sort of noticed as a very broad, I suppose, without wishing to overgeneralize too much, but one of the things I noticed was that there were some age demographics in terms of things which featured heavily in people's deconstruction. And for people more or less over 50, it was often more of a theological deconstruction, looking at things like substitutionary atonement and hell and this kind of thing. For people from roughly kind of early 30s up to 50, particularly women, it was often purity culture. For people under 30, it was very much often values driven. So, while you can say, well, they haven't had time to construct much of anything, they've certainly got values. And I think it's an extraordinary generation. People throw out words like snowflake, but actually I'm kind of going, this is a generation which has such care for their community.
That's good.
The values around things like racial justice, LGBTQ justice, environmental issues were very much, and the church's, lack of action on some of these issues were very much, and I had a friend the other day saying, this is a missional issue. The church needs to get itself together on this because people are leaving over these issues. It was very values driven, and people finding community which shared those values again.
Yeah, that rings true in terms of that generational distinction, and that's really significant. Does that impact the way you advise, whether someone is older or younger, Preston?
It does beg the question of like, why is the most cause-oriented generation so disconnected from the most cause-oriented organization in the world, right? Which would be the church, at least what we would say is the most cause-oriented organization. And so for me, it's like, as Olivia's talking, I'm like, oh yeah, it did kind of break up into age groups that way. I didn't have that insight until she was speaking. But I would say getting the specific, even of all generation, hey, why that question? How can I help you go through that question? And then also to the younger generation, we have to allow them to answer differently, right? Churches kind of have to capitalize on this, say, you can come here, it's a good place to ask questions. I'm like, that's not even the issue. The issue is it a safe place to answer differently? And if the answer is no, well, then it's not a safe place to question. And so the younger generation needs to know, hey, there is safety here. If you end up answering this in a different way than me, it's going to be okay.
Yeah, excellent. I know it's been such a significant part of my own journey to be in communities that have allowed me to ask questions. My training is in philosophy, and there were very deep questions from my parents from a young age that they didn't know what to do with. But, I'm very thankful for the sort of versions of the Doubters Club that I sort of found organically along the way. And I always sort of thought that if God isn't big enough to deal with my questions, then that's an issue. And every question has a true answer. And if Christianity is true, then people should believe that all truth is in some way grounded in God. So people shouldn't be afraid of questions. They should welcome them and go on that journey together to wherever they lead. I want to give each of you an opportunity before we finish to maybe offer any advice that you would give to the church, or maybe like specifically, there are probably quite a few evangelical church leaders who are listening to this podcast. Olivia, you have sat with people and heard their stories of how many have been hurt and why they've gone through this process of deconstruction. I don't know what your advice would be. I don't know if it's if it's an evangelical church, it should close its doors. But maybe there's also some advice in the direction of how the church and church leaders in particular can better support people who are going through this process of deconstruction.
I think again, it's the matter of trusting the people in your care. They are thinking, feeling beings, and they're not just trying to rebel and throw it all out the window. They're on an honest process, an honest journey, and it's worth listening to people and supporting them as best they can. And they may leave, but actually letting them do that and not ostracizing them. It's a terrifying thing to leave community. People aren't doing it because they hate you. They're asking honest questions, and allow your church to be a safe space for those honest questions, because the questions are bigger than any one church. And the questions, if God is who the church claims God is, then God is going to be big enough to hold those questions.
Wonderful. Yeah, I've always appreciated the fact that Jesus so frequently responded to people's questions with questions. And I think that was partly because he did want to understand the depth of what was behind someone's question rather than to rush to give the right answer. How about for you, Preston? With the Doubters Club, you've interacted with so many people who have been disillusioned by the church, the evangelical church in particular. What advice would you give to leaders that are listening right now?
Oh, to leaders, I would say if your theology is hurting your relationships and not healing them, there is something that's just not Jesus-centric about the foundation of what you've built. I would also say to the leaders, if you're kind of on the fringe and you're keeping quiet, but you're asking the same questions as your congregants, but you just know your paycheck doesn't allow you to do that, find another way to get a paycheck, because we don't want to perpetuate the problem. We want to be a shepherd and to lead and to guide. And so please be authentic. And so that would be kind of both sides of the coin, right? One person who's deconstructing, but in the closet about it, and the other person who's not deconstructing, but they realize their relationships are hurt when their theology comes to the surface. Yes, that would be my advice.
Excellent. Personally, I think we need a lot more of this, the sort of listening in the context of real relationship that both of you have modeled. It's too easy to point the finger critically at those who are deconstructing and never ask the question why they're deconstructing. And maybe sometimes in the church, we are afraid to ask that question because we fear we might be part of the answer, or at least I can say personally that I have known that temptation. We have to leave it there for today. Thank you very much to my guests, Olivia Jackson and Preston Ulmer. Thank you both for befriending and giving voice to so many whose stories need to be heard. Thank you to all of our listeners. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. As always, we love to hear your feedback. Keep the conversation going. Email us. And until next time, I'm Vince Vitale, and you have been listening to Unbelievable.